I never thought I'd find myself at war with a homeowners association over property that wasn't even under their jurisdiction. But here we are. What began as a dream, purchasing a peaceful cabin tucked away in the woods, slowly spiraled into a full-blown legal mess that not only shook my life, but also dragged the so-called leaders of the HOA into a courtroom they never thought they'd see. It started with an innocent purchase. After years of working long hours in the city, dealing with constant noise, traffic, and stress, I decided I needed an escape. Something quiet. Something mine. I started looking for properties outside the city, far away from HOA neighborhoods, because I already knew their reputation for being overbearing. Finally, after months of searching, I found it. A rustic cabin on a piece of land nestled against a river. It was secluded, private, and perfect. No cookie-cutter houses lined up like military barracks, no HOA board members sticking their noses into every decision. Just me, my cabin, and the quiet hum of nature. Or so I thought. I signed the papers, went through all the legalities, and proudly became the owner of my getaway cabin. Everything seemed smooth, at least for the first few months. I spent weekends fixing it up, adding little touches, making it a retreat where my family and I could relax. It was meant to be a place free from rules, regulations, and interference. Then one afternoon, while I was repairing the front porch, I found a letter taped to the door. At first glance, it looked official, embossed letterhead, neat formatting, and bold letters at the top, Notice of Violation, Homeowners Association. I laughed when I saw it. I genuinely thought it was some sort of prank. After all, my cabin wasn't inside an HOA community. The closest HOA neighborhood was miles away, and I specifically checked, during the buying process, that the property was free of any such entanglements. But as I read further, the letter claimed that I was in violation of HOA landscaping standards, and owed them a fine for failing to maintain my property according to their rules. The amount wasn't massive, $250, but that wasn't the point. The sheer audacity made my blood boil. I crumpled the letter and tossed it aside. There was no way these people had any legal authority over me. At least, that's what I believed at the time. A week later, another letter arrived. This one was more aggressive, warning me that if I didn't pay, additional fines would accrue. It claimed that as a member of the HOA community, I was subject to all their regulations. The kicker? They even threatened a lien on my property. Now, I wasn't just annoyed. I was furious. I marched straight to the county office, pulled up all the public property maps, and verified what I already knew: my cabin was outside their jurisdiction. In fact, it wasn't even in the same zoning district. Armed with the documentation, I wrote back to the HOA, telling them in no uncertain terms to leave me alone. You'd think that would have been the end of it. But instead, that's when the real battle began. Within days, HOA representatives started showing up. They drove up the gravel road leading to my cabin, parked outside, and took photos as if they were investigators gathering evidence for a crime scene. One of them even had the audacity to confront me face to face. A woman in her late 50s, dressed in business casual attire that didn't match the rural setting, introduced herself as the HOA president. With a smug smile plastered on her face, she informed me that whether I liked it or not, my cabin fell under their expanded territory. I nearly burst out laughing at her words. Expanded territory. Was this a medieval kingdom now, with HOA leaders acting like lords trying to annex my land? I told her to leave. She didn't. Instead, she handed me another letter and said, "If you refuse to cooperate, this will get much more difficult for you." At that moment, I realized these people weren't just petty, they were dangerous. I contacted my lawyer, explained the situation, and he confirmed what I already suspected. the HOA had absolutely no claim over my property. But he also warned me that HOAs were notorious for pushing boundaries, hoping homeowners would give in out of fear or ignorance. And I wasn't about to be one of their victims. Still, the harassment escalated. More letters came, each more threatening than the last. HOA members showed up at odd hours, taking pictures, measuring parts of my property, as if preparing some sort of bogus report. The final straw came when I received a notice claiming I owed over $2,500 in accumulated fines. According to them, I had ignored repeated warnings and was now facing legal consequences. That's when I decided enough was enough. I gathered every single letter, every photograph I'd taken of their so-called visits, and marched straight into my lawyer's office. He didn't hesitate. He told me, "We're taking them to court. This isn't just harassment, it's fraud." And just like that, the fight officially began. What the HOA didn't realize was that their arrogance had blinded them. They assumed I'd fold, that I'd pay up just to get them off my back. They had no idea I was prepared to drag them through every legal channel available, exposing their corruption for all to see. They wanted to play games. Fine. But this time, they picked the wrong person. And soon, their so-called leaders would be standing before a judge, trying to explain why they thought they had the right to fine someone for a cabin that didn't even belong to their neighborhood. This was only the beginning. The weeks following my decision to lawyer up were anything but peaceful. What should have been quiet weekends at my cabin turned into a full-blown war zone of intimidation, threats, and bizarre antics from people who believed they had power over me. At first, I thought maybe the HOA would back down once they realized I wasn't just some pushover. After all, my lawyer sent them a cease and desist letter citing county maps, deeds, and zoning documents that made it crystal clear my cabin was outside their reach. Case closed, right? Wrong. Instead of retreating, the HOA doubled down. They began sending me certified letters every few days, each with new violations listed. According to them, my unpaved driveway was against community standards. My wood-burning stove didn't comply with air quality guidelines. Even the color of my cabin's shutters was suddenly a problem. It was laughable. My property was surrounded by forest, with no neighbors in sight, and yet they acted as if I was somehow lowering the aesthetic value of their suburban neighborhood 3 miles away. The more ridiculous their claims became, the more I realized this wasn't about rules, it was about control. These people thrived on power, and my refusal to bow down was threatening their little empire. One evening, I returned to the cabin after a long work week, only to find an orange sticker plastered across my front door, Notice of Pending Enforcement Action. It looked eerily similar to government-issued tags for condemned properties. For a moment, I felt a pit in my stomach. But as I peeled it off and read the fine print, I couldn't help but shake my head in disbelief. It was yet another scare tactic, signed by the HOA president herself. That's when I realized they weren't just bluffing, they were trying to break me mentally. I wasn't alone in this, though. Word of my battle started spreading around town. The local cafe owner, an older gentleman who had lived in the area for decades, pulled me aside one morning and said, "You're not the first person they've harassed. They've been trying to stretch their influence for years." Apparently, this HOA had a reputation for being one of the most aggressive in the county. They'd already clashed with neighboring landowners, bullying them into selling or paying fines they didn't actually owe. Most people gave in simply because fighting them seemed like too much trouble. But I wasn't most people. I started documenting everything more thoroughly. Every letter was photographed, scanned, and stored. Every unexpected visit was filmed. I even installed security cameras around the cabin just to catch them in the act. If they wanted to play dirty, I'd have evidence ready to bury them. My lawyer filed an official harassment complaint, and within days, the county sheriff paid me a visit. He was polite, but clearly uncomfortable. "I've had multiple calls from the HOA about you," he admitted. "They're claiming you're refusing to comply with community laws." I handed him a copy of my deed, the county zoning map, and the latest pile of bogus HOA letters. He looked at the documents, then back at me and sighed. "Looks like they're overstepping. I'll file a report." But even the sheriff seemed hesitant to confront them directly. That told me just how deep this HOA's influence ran. The harassment, however, didn't stop. In fact, it got creepier. One Saturday morning, I woke up to the sound of tires crunching gravel. Looking out the window, I saw 3 SUVs parked at the edge of my driveway. A group of people in matching polos with the HOA's logo stood there with clipboards, snapping photos like paparazzi. I stormed outside and demanded to know what they were doing. One man, tall with sunglasses and an air of arrogance, said, "We're conducting an inspection. You're required to allow us access." I laughed so hard I nearly doubled over. "Required? You have no authority here. This is private property. Leave before I call the sheriff." The man smirked. "You'll regret this. Non-compliance has consequences." That was the moment I knew they were digging their own grave. Every word he said was caught on my security cameras, audio and all. My lawyer was ecstatic when I showed him the footage. "This is gold," he said. "They're not just overreaching, they're impersonating officials. That's fraud, intimidation, and trespassing all rolled into one." We officially filed suit, naming the HOA and several of its board members personally. The complaint accused them of harassment, fraud, defamation of title, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. The county court scheduled a preliminary hearing, and suddenly the HOA's confidence began to crack. But before that day arrived, they tried one last desperate move. One evening, I came up to the cabin and found a giant banner hung across my gate. In bold black letters, it read, "Violator property under HOA review." That was the line they should never have crossed. Not only was it a blatant act of harassment, but it also interfered with my property rights. Anyone driving by might have thought I was breaking the law. It was slander in its purest form. I called my lawyer that night and said, "No more warnings. I want them in court as soon as possible." And that's exactly what happened. The HOA board probably thought they could bully me like they had bullied so many others. But instead of folding, I had turned their tactics into ammunition. Every fake notice, every trespassing visit, every threat, they were all neatly catalogued, ready for a judge to see. By the time the court date rolled around, I wasn't nervous anymore. I was determined. Because this wasn't just about me anymore. This was about every landowner they had ever tried to intimidate. This was about drawing a line in the sand and saying, "No more." And when the gavel finally struck, the real reckoning would begin. The morning of the hearing felt surreal. I wasn't used to courtrooms or legal battles. I was just an ordinary person who wanted a quiet cabin in the woods, yet here I was, about to go head-to-head with an organization that thrived on intimidation. As I walked through the courthouse doors, I clutched a folder packed with evidence, photos, letters, video footage, and copies of my deed. My lawyer walked beside me, calm and confident, his briefcase filled with the same arsenal of proof. We entered the courtroom, and there they were, the HOA board members. 4 of them sat stiffly at the defense table, their faces twisted into expressions that wavered between arrogance and unease. The president, the same woman who had once stood in my driveway acting like a queen in her expanded territory, sat at the center, flanked by her cronies. For a moment, I almost laughed. These were the people who had tried to terrify me, the people who taped fraudulent notices to my door, who hung banners calling me a violator. Up close, they didn't look powerful at all. They looked like school bullies finally dragged to the principal's office. When the judge entered, the room went silent. Everyone rose, then sat again. My heart raced, but I forced myself to breathe steadily. This wasn't about nerves anymore, it was about justice. The proceedings began with my lawyer presenting our case. He laid everything out systematically, beginning with the deed and zoning maps. Your Honor, he said firmly, this property lies completely outside the jurisdiction of the defendant's homeowners association. Yet the defendants repeatedly issued fraudulent violation notices, attempted to levy fines, trespassed on private land, and defamed my client's title. He handed the judge copies of the official county maps, highlighting the bold line that marked the HOA's true boundary. My cabin sat well outside of it. The judge's eyebrows arched slightly as he studied the documents. Then came the letters. My lawyer presented them one by one, each stamped with the HOA's logo and signed by their officers. He read aloud their threats of liens, fines, and enforcement actions. Each word echoed through the courtroom like a hammer striking an anvil. When he finally played the video clips, showing HOA members trespassing, photographing my cabin, and demanding access, the mood shifted. Murmurs rippled across the small audience that had gathered to watch. Even the judge leaned back in his chair, clearly unimpressed with what he was seeing. The defense tried to fight back, of course. Their attorney, a polished man in a tailored suit, argued that the HOA believed my property was functionally part of their community. He claimed that expansion clauses in their bylaws allowed them to enforce rules on adjacent properties impacting community standards. The judge's eyes narrowed. Show me where, in county law, that clause grants jurisdiction over land outside your recorded boundary. The defense attorney stammered, flipping through his papers. He cited vague language from the HOA's own handbook, but the judge cut him off. That's not binding law. That's internal policy. You cannot extend your authority beyond recorded limits. Strike one. Next, the defense tried to justify their actions as protecting property values. They argued that my cabin's rustic appearance and non-standard landscaping were detrimental to nearby homes. My lawyer countered swiftly. Your Honor, my client's property is not visible from the HOA community. It is separated by miles of forest. This argument is nothing more than an excuse to justify harassment. To prove it, he showed drone footage we had commissioned, mapping out the distance between my cabin and their neighborhood. It was laughable. My place was so isolated that no one from the HOA could possibly see it without driving directly onto my land. Strike two. Then came the turning point. My lawyer introduced the video recording of the HOA representative in sunglasses, the one who had told me, non-compliance has consequences. The court watched as he strutted around my property with his clipboard, demanding access and threatening me. When the video ended, the judge looked directly at the defense table. Is that one of your board members? The HOA president hesitated. Her face flushed, and she muttered, Yes, Your Honor. Strike three. The room grew tense. My lawyer pressed further, calling me to the stand. I testified about the months of harassment, the constant letters, the bogus fines, the banner labeling my home as a violator. I described how it felt to have strangers trespassing on my land, intimidating me, and threatening liens that could ruin my financial security. I didn't embellish. I didn't need to. The facts spoke for themselves. When I stepped down, the defense called the HOA president to the stand. She tried to paint herself as a misunderstood leader, someone just doing her job. She insisted they only wanted me to comply with community standards. But under cross-examination, her carefully built image crumbled. My lawyer asked one simple question: did you know, before sending the first fine, that Mr. ______'s property was not inside your HOA boundary? She froze. Her eyes darted to her attorney. Finally, she muttered, "We believed." "Answer yes or no," my lawyer pressed. "Yes," she whispered. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Even the judge looked unimpressed. That one word exposed the truth. They knew they had no authority, and yet they went after me anyway. By the time closing arguments arrived, the defense had little left to stand on. Their case was a house of cards, and every piece of evidence we presented had knocked it closer to collapse. My lawyer ended with a powerful statement: "Your Honor, this case isn't just about one homeowner. It's about an organization abusing its power, deliberately stepping beyond its bounds, and harassing someone who simply wanted to be left alone. If this kind of behavior goes unchecked, what's to stop HOAs from claiming dominion over any land they choose?" The judge nodded thoughtfully, his expression stern. He didn't issue a ruling right away, but as he dismissed the court for the day, I could already sense where the scales of justice were tipping. Walking out of that courtroom, I felt lighter than I had in months. For the first time since this nightmare began, I knew I wasn't fighting alone. The truth was out, and the HOA's mask of authority had been ripped away. They had tried to drag me down with lies and threats, but now they were the ones facing judgment. And soon, the consequences of their arrogance would come crashing down on them harder than they ever imagined. The courtroom was packed again, when the judge reconvened a week later to deliver his ruling. I could feel the tension in the air, thick enough to cut with a knife. The HOA board members sat rigid in their chairs, their confident postures from the first day gone, replaced with visible anxiety. The judge cleared his throat, adjusted his glasses, and began. "This case has brought forward troubling behavior from an organization entrusted with community governance," he said. His voice carried the weight of authority, steady and deliberate. "The evidence presented has made one fact undeniable: the defendants knowingly acted outside their jurisdiction." My heart pounded. I leaned forward, hanging on every word. The judge continued, "Mr. ______'s property lies entirely outside the HOA's recorded boundaries. The defendants had no legal authority to issue fines, demand compliance, or trespass. Yet they did so repeatedly, despite clear documentation to the contrary." The HOA president's face turned pale. One of the board members shifted uncomfortably, whispering something to their attorney. The judge wasn't done. "Furthermore," he said, his tone sharpening, "this court has seen evidence of fraudulent notices, intimidation, and slanderous labeling of private property. These actions amount not only to harassment, but also to a gross abuse of power." He paused, scanning the room before delivering the blow. "Therefore, this court rules in favor of the plaintiff." I felt an enormous weight lift off my shoulders. It was over, or at least, the hardest part was. But then came the part that made the room erupt in gasps. "The defendants are hereby ordered to pay damages to the plaintiff in the amount of $75,000 for harassment, legal fees, and emotional distress. Additionally, a permanent injunction is issued, forbidding the HOA from making any future claims, fines, or encroachments on properties outside their recorded boundaries." The HOA board members sat stunned, their empire of intimidation crumbling in real time. The president, who once strutted into my driveway with smug confidence, now looked like a defeated monarch watching her kingdom burn. But the judge wasn't finished. "Given the severity of the misconduct," he said firmly, "this court is also referring the matter to the district attorney's office for review of potential criminal charges related to fraud and trespassing." The room went silent, as if everyone had collectively stopped breathing. The HOA's lawyer buried his face in his hands. The board members exchanged frantic whispers. The president visibly trembled. For the first time, they were on the receiving end of consequences, and not the kind they could bully their way out of. As the gavel struck, I exhaled a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. The nightmare was finally over. Walking out of that courtroom felt surreal. Supporters from the community, people I didn't even know, approached me with pats on the back and words of encouragement. "You did what nobody else could," one man said. "You stood up to them." It turned out, my case had inspired others. Several former landowners who had been bullied by the HOA came forward, ready to file their own lawsuits. The local newspaper even ran a story about the trial, calling it a landmark victory against HOA overreach. The ripple effect was undeniable. What started as one man standing up for his rights had exposed a corrupt system that had gone unchecked for far too long. As for me, I returned to my cabin with a sense of peace I hadn't felt in months. No more letters taped to my door. No more bogus fines. No more strangers trespassing with clipboards. Just silence, the rustle of the trees, and the crackle of my wood-burning stove. I took the old banner they had once hung across my gate, the one that read, "Violator property under HOA review," and nailed it to the inside of my shed as a reminder. Not of the harassment, but of the victory. A symbol of standing my ground. The HOA leaders, meanwhile, had their own battles to face. Civil damages were only the beginning. Reports spread quickly that the president had stepped down, and whispers of criminal investigations swirled. For an organization that thrived on control, they had lost everything in one fell swoop. And honestly, they had nobody to blame but themselves. Because here's the truth, power unchecked becomes dangerous. When people let authority go to their heads, they forget the limits of their role. They stop seeing themselves as volunteers serving a community, and start acting like rulers of their own little kingdoms. But sooner or later, someone pushes back. And when the spotlight of truth shines on their corruption, their power crumbles. That someone, in this case, happened to be me. An ordinary guy who just wanted a quiet place to escape. Looking back now, I realize the fight was never just about one cabin in the woods. It was about drawing a line in the sand and saying, "You don't get to own me. You don't get to decide what I do with what's mine." And in the end, the judge made sure they understood that. Loud and clear. So when I sit on the porch of my cabin now, listening to the river flow, I smile. Not because I wanted a fight, but because I didn't let fear win. I didn't let a group of power-hungry board members rewrite the rules of ownership. I won back my peace, my property, and my dignity. And the HOA? They walked into court thinking they owned me. They walked out realizing they had lost everything.